Two things you want to do when you're hand sanding a blade is, number one, have some kind of a backer, whether it's a piece of steel or hardwood, whatever, that is going to hold your sandpaper and really make that work the best for you. Because if you just use a piece of sandpaper with your thumb or whatever, it's going to float over those minor imperfections. It's not going to work as well for you, and it's going to be more fatiguing. So use some kind of a stiff backer or something to hand sand with, like this. Secondly, what I always do is use some kind of ammonia-based cleaner, whether it's straight ammonia or window cleaner, whatever, it doesn't matter. But this will enhance the cutability and longevity of your sandpaper a lot, and it's going to make hand sanding much easier. It does not rust your blade. That ammonia content, whether it's straight ammonia or whatever, like I said, it doesn't rust the blade, and it works as a agent to carry away the tiny pieces of metal that would otherwise clog up your sandpaper and improves the cutability. So those two tricks are going to make hand sanding a blade much easier. Now our goal is to remove all of the previous grinding or sanding marks with our current grit before we move on to the next one. And presumably all of our previous grind marks are going to be running approximately perpendicular to the blade. So sanding parallel to the blade is going to be the best way to see these heavier grit marks and remove them as efficiently as possible. Okay, so I have the blade down to 400 grit on both sides, little divot there that I did with the wheel. That's gonna just be some character, but I have our piece of wood turned 90 degrees and clamped to the table. The blade clamped with another clamp and then a screw so that it can, push down on that. And I'm gonna take this opportunity while the blade is soft to clean up the spine profile with a file. Good one. Okay, so we have the profile of the blade cleaned up, the spine and the edge, and a little sharpening choil in there. So at this point, we're going to go ahead and normalize our blade and get it ready for the final heat treating processes. This next stage is called normalizing, and what that does is get the steel in the best condition for hardening as possible. This being basically 1080 high carbon steel with some nickel in it. It's very heat treat friendly with simple tools. I'm going to use a piece of soft fire brick. This can be purchased on eBay, just 1 or 2 bricks even, for pretty inexpensively. And we're going to see if we can try to use this to help us get as much out of our torch as we can to get the appropriate level of heat. So it's going to reflect it back on the blade. So the goal with what we just did there, the normalizing, is not what we were doing earlier. We want to heat this up to a hotter temperature, about an orange color, to where it becomes non-magnetic, and you can test that with a little magnet. But the purpose here is to turn this into perlite, which is not something we want to try to drill through. So once this is air cooled, you don't want to quench this at this point. Once this is air cooled, we can then go ahead and heat it back up for the quenching process, which will actually harden the steel, and then we can temper it. The fire brick that I used there gives us enough of a bounce back on that heat to effectively heat up this blade. Now on the quench, what we're going to do is something a little different. We're going to do an edge quench. So that means, or a differential quench. We're going to heat up the edge of the blade, so about the bottom half, and leave the rest of this a little bit cooler. What that is going to do is give us a very tough blade with the appropriate hardness at the edge for the edge holding that it needs. This is also a great method because we don't have a huge amount of heat available to us. One thing you can do with a little torch like that is make a 1 brick forge. You can look that up and that can make it even more effective, but we're not going to do that today. We'll keep this simple and get a good edge on this knife. The next step is to go ahead and hit this with some sandpaper again and get it polished back up, because we need to be able to see some clean, bright steel in order to effectively temper this as quickly as possible after quenching. Now you'll notice this area here that is much cleaner where the scale popped off in the quench, and that's a good sign that we had we were in the range of the appropriate heat. Tempering requires much less heat than the previous operations we've done so far. I'm going to heat up this area and along the spine and stay away from the edge as much as possible, because we want the heat to run towards the edge and sort of get this edge the heat that we want it to be through that method instead of directly putting the flame on there. What we want to see is a color that's the faintest straw color. You want to do this in some good light, and I find it's best to apply some heat and wait a moment and then apply some more heat, because if you just continuously apply heat, you're not really seeing the effect that it's having as the entire blade equalizes in temperature. Now this method where you watch your colors, the tempering colors run, and do it that way, you have to know approximately at least what the carbon content of your steel is in order for that to be of any use to you. You could temper a piece of steel out to say a light straw or a dark straw or a vermilion or a dark blue or whatever, but it really doesn't mean anything unless you know what the carbon content is. And since we know this is about 0.8% carbon, I'm going to go with a light straw that's going to give us a nice hardness to the edge so that we have a good edge holding capability on this knife. So you see I already have a dark straw here. I gotta go dip that in water. Typically I do this right by a water pan, and I should have mentioned that a minute ago. I just cooled this off because that right there is the color that I want. You really don't want to do it like I just did, where I had to move across the room to stop the heat on this, because that can easily be far too long, and you can temper your blade out too much, lose too much of the hardness. And so we're going to carefully apply some more heat and try to get the rest of the edge this same color right down here, just a light straw. Of course, the thickness of your steel that you're working with definitely plays a big role in how much heat you need and how quickly it's going to heat up. Should point out that this can also be easily done in the kitchen oven, where you would put this in for, say, an hour or two at 375 degrees, maybe 400. So you'll notice how I will apply some heat and give it a minute, or a second I should say, and then you'll see the colors suddenly start to appear. And that's why you want to be careful about how much heat you apply at one time. Just want this area right in here to be a little bit darker, just a tiny bit darker. You have to be aware of the difference in thickness on the blade. The spine is thicker than the edge, obviously. So this is the flip side from where we were working, and the colors are a little more gradual on this side. Obviously the heat's a little less direct, so that's looking really good. And you can see some difference where we had the water lines there and stuff. And keep in mind, this checking the colors and everything doesn't really mean much unless you have clean, bright steel. Okay, so you can put things in the tempering oven, and depending on the atmospheric conditions, how long it's in there, different oils that might be on the blade, all those things, you can get some darker colors that do not indicate the temperature or hardness to which your blade is tempered. So make sure you do this with clean, bright steel. And again, make sure you know what carbon content you have, otherwise it's pretty much meaningless. So at this point we can go ahead and clean up the rest of the blade, and we'll be ready for a handle and then finally an edge. I've got the blade cleaned up back to 400 grit on both sides, so that's good. Next thing I want to do is prep the tang for putting the handle scales on. I'm going to use some emery cloth, which is very coarse, abrasive material, and just clean off all this scale on both sides of the tang so that it's ready to bond with the epoxy that we're going to use to help hold our handle scales on. Alright, for our handle scale material today I've got a piece of hickory, and one reason I'm going to use this is because it's already flat on two sides, so it's much thicker than we need, and I want to be able to split this down the center and make a handle out of this. So I'm going to go ahead and mark out sort of where the outline is for our tang. That's going to give us an idea of what we need to cut off here. So now we have a piece of wood that's plenty thick enough for both handle scales, and we need to split it down the middle, or cut it down the middle I should say. But before we do that, we're going to go ahead and put our handle holes in it, and I'm going to just mark the other side so that we know the orientation or the indexing of, it doesn't have to be exactly the same, just so we know the indexing of the handle. I know I said we need 2 clamps when we're doing power tools. We're just drilling through wood here. I think we'll be okay. It's going to be important that we keep this drill as vertical or straight up and down as possible. If we have it tipping side to side or anything like that, that's going to translate to our pin assembly and not be good. So just be careful. Alright, now we've got this fancy setup here, and we're going to cut this down the center using a handsaw once again. So it doesn't matter if this is not 100% perfect, just as long as it's pretty much in the center so we have equal stock to work with on both sides. Oops, that's what you want to go for. I'm already started wrong, so let's start up here. Okay, so we have 2 handle scales here. This will be the inside, this will be the outside. Doesn't really matter that it's rough because that's all going to be finished anyway. So let's go ahead and work on our handle pin stock. I'm actually going to use brass tubing.